Happy Monday. Thank you for joining me for this week's Weekly Wisdom. Now, this is a continuation of our series as we're looking at some uncomfortable truths. This is in celebration of African American Month and really giving space to look at how we show up versus how we want to show up. And this week we are focusing on how do I grow, right? We think about growth and it's like, oh, it's easy. We just have a couple of conversations, we Google some things, we read some things, and boom, we grow. It's not actually the case. Would y'all believe that humans are very similar to lobsters? Now you may be asking yourself, I am not a lobster. I don't have a shell. I don't live in the water. How am I similar to a lobster? Well, you see, lobsters aren't born in a giant shell that they will eventually grow into. They will reach a point to where it is so uncomfortable to be in that shell. They have gotten so big they can no longer fit. And that is when they will start the molting process. That is when they will allow themselves the space and room to grow. As humans, we're a lot like that. We don't grow unless we have to. I remember many years ago being in a therapy session and my therapist looked at me and she said something that I will never forget. She said, you would rather be comfortably uncomfortable than put in the work to change. Y'all head went, I was like, what? No, ma'am. But then I thought about it and I realized that she was right. I would rather be comfortable in the discomfort that I knew instead of putting work into leaning into who I wanted to become. And when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion and creating an inclusive workforce as leaders, many times we find ourselves in that situation. We're not going to put the work in, to do the work, to change because it's uncomfortable. And sometimes we don't allow for the space for our employees or our families to change. Sometimes our families don't allow the space for us to change. I reached this point in my journey where I wasn't ready to speak out against things that were being said by people that I loved. But I also wasn't at that point where I was going to agree with it. And so there was a lot of times when conversations would happen where there would be that overt racism or not overt, subtle racism or discrimination, and I would just go quiet. You would see me physically lean back out of the conversation. And somebody who is very close to me, who means the world to me, pointed it out and said that I had lost my backbone, that I wasn't raised that way. And it hurt. Like, if I'm being real with y'all, that hurt. I remember the moment that it happened. I remember the smell of being outside. It was springtime and the birds and the butterflies. It is seared in my memory because it hurt. And sometimes when we're trying to grow, when we're trying to be better and do better and learn more, it can be uncomfortable for those around us. But does it mean that we should stop? Because in that moment, I realized that I did have a backbone, because it took every ounce of courage that I had to keep moving forward in that process. And I started getting more comfortable speaking up. Because quite honestly, if I was going to be judged no matter what, then let's go down this road and let's have these conversations, right? So I want you to think about that as you're moving forward and as you're growing. It's not always going to be comfortable. You're not always going to have the right answer. You're not always going to get the positive feedback from those that are in your inner circle like you would hope. It doesn't mean that you should stop doing it. It doesn't mean that it isn't important. And when you do make a misstep, when you do maybe avoid a conversation, give yourself grace. This isn't easy. If it were easy, then everybody would have done it by now. When we're going down this road of looking how we fit in the world that we thought we knew versus how we fit in the world that we're learning about, it causes a lot of discomfort. It causes us to look at our world in a completely different way. And that idea of being comfortably uncomfortable is a very real thing. So I just challenge you, as you move forward into this week, what is a conversation that you've been avoiding? What is a moment that maybe somebody said something and you're like, that can't be true, but it's just sticking in your head? Do some research. Get out there and learn about uncomfortable truths. When you realize that the world isn't the fairy tale that we have been told, but it's also not brimstone and fire either, then you can move forward to understand what it actually is. And as a leader who has power and influence over others, that is where you need to be. So thank you for joining me for this week's Weekly Wisdom. I hope you have an absolutely amazing week. And don't forget, as always, you got this. We'll see you next week.